Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. My name is Professor Wendy Schiller. I'm the interim director. And we are really privileged today in honor of Constitution Day to have a man with an amazing range of experience, notably the former Deputy Attorney General in the George W. Bush administration, as well as working for a number of different companies as a private attorney, and also as most recently and currently as a law professor at the University of Georgia Law School, among many things. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce our moderator, Mark Dunkelman, who's a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute, and he will introduce Larry Thompson. And then you'll speak for however long you want to speak.
Until I see people falling asleep.
Yes, probably about 30 minutes or 35 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So we'll be doing that, and this is live streamed, so we will pass around microphones for you when you want to ask your questions. All right, let's get started.
Thank you, Wendy. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to everybody on the live stream. Larry Thompson serves as a counsel to the Atlanta law firm of Finch McCraney, LLP. Mr. Thompson retired in December 2014 as Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel and Corporate Secretary for PepsiCo. He previously served as PepsiCo's Senior Vice President for Government Affairs, General Counsel and Secretary from 2004 to 2011. He served as a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution in Washington, and his government career includes serving in the U.S. Department of Justice as the U.S. Deputy Attorney General under President George W. Bush. In 2002, Attorney General John Ashcroft named Mr. Thompson to lead the National Security Coordination Council. Also in 2002, President Bush named Mr. Thompson to head the Corporate Fraud Task Force. Previously, Mr. Thompson was partner at the Atlanta, Georgia law firm of King & Spalding. In April 2000, Mr. Thompson was selected by Congress to chair the Judicial Review Commission on Foreign Asset Control. In 2017, he was appointed by the U.S. Department of Justice as the Independent Corporate Compliance Monitor and Auditor for Volkswagen AG. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Culver Stockton College, a master's degree from Michigan State University, and a law degree from the University of Michigan. Please welcome him here to the Watson Institute.
Thank you, Mark. Mark and I really go back a long way. This is the first time we've actually met in person. I wrote a book, and Mark was very helpful to me in formulating this book, helping me to prepare things that might be of interest to people. This is the first book I've ever written. I've written a lot of things as a lawyer. The book is called Quiet Counsel, and I'll talk a little bit about why I used that title. But it was an interesting process being my first book. It's a book in which I look back. I've practiced law for 50 years. I've really enjoyed practicing law. I've had these big buckets of different things in my career. But it's a book in which I look back and as I say, on the power of law to help make our society better. And hopefully we can cover some of those things this afternoon. But the interesting thing in writing the book was when I had a pretty fulsome outline, I had to submit it to different publishers. And one publisher actually thought some of the things were very interesting in the book, but he said, "Larry, you've been around a long time, and you must have some enemies." And I said, "Well, I have a few enemies." He says, "Well, what you need to do and what you didn't do in this book is identify your enemies and then settle the score with your enemies in the book." So this book is not like that. It's really it's a sort of a policy tome, if you will. It was really enjoyable working with Mark as we worked through exactly how to formulate the book. And I just would like to mention one thing before I get into the substance. You know, I had to think to myself, why do you write a book at this stage of your life? I've practiced law for 50 years. I'll be 79 in November. You know, why do you write a book? And I had to think, well, I don't think I'm writing it for vanity purposes, to try to tell my side of the story, or to try to put myself in a good light when I move on. I don't think I did it for that. I wouldn't want to spend as much time as I did for that purpose. But when I think about why I tried to write a book that would be helpful to people like you, and as I look out into this audience, the young people, I think I wrote the book for hope, and that is, it would be a part of a way for me to pass on my experiences after 50 years of practicing law in lots of different venues, my experiences for another generation. And so I hope the book will be helpful to you all. Let me begin by talking about public service. Public service has obviously been a very important part of my career. I served as Deputy Attorney General, as Mark said in his introduction, during the administration of President Bush. And it was by far the most difficult and searing experience of my career. And let me tell you why. And it's only a few days from 9/11. So, as you know, during the Bush administration, we were hit on 9/11, and I'll talk a little bit about that, my involvement in 9/11 and what it did to me, and what it means to me. So I was sworn in to be the Deputy Attorney General of the United States in May of 2001. And I had been a domestic lawyer. I had done work in Atlanta in the criminal defense area, white-collar criminal defense area, handling government investigations for individual executives and companies, and for companies themselves. I didn't have any experience internationally or national security. And I started to go to National Security Council meetings. And there's a separate meeting of all the deputies of the different agencies going to the National Security Council meetings. And I really had my eyes open. So in July of 2001, the intelligence officials who were briefing us in these meetings indicated that there's a lot of noise in the system. And what do you mean by noise in the system? And that is, through human intelligence or through electronic intelligence, we were learning, we being United States officials, we were learning that a terrorist attack, likely by Al-Qaeda, was imminent. But imminent as it relates to American interest overseas. I don't recall anyone thinking that a terrorist attack on the homeland was imminent, but I do remember lots of information about noise in the system and about the fact that a terrorist attack was imminent. So we were working hard to do what we could to prevent this from happening. And I had two really wonderful individuals working for me. David Criss, who's gone on to do a lot of things in the intellectual property world. David Criss was a holdover by me from the Janet Reno administration. He worked for then Deputy Attorney General Eric Holder. I kept David in my office. He was an expert. And Michael Chertoff, who was the head of the criminal division and went on to be the Secretary of Homeland Security. They were also in my office. And during the course of that summer, Mike and David told me that things were really not working well in the national security front. The intelligence officials and agents were not sharing information with the law enforcement agents and with the lawyers in the criminal division of the United States Department of Justice. Why were they doing that? Well, there was a wall that had been established to make certain that there would be limited improper use of intelligence information in law enforcement. So, for example, if law enforcement suspects someone, if I'm suspected of doing something wrong and they need to listen in on my telephone conversations, the FBI is required, because I'm a citizen, the FBI is required to go to a magistrate judge, have probable cause, and get a warrant to listen to my conversations. You don't have to do that in intelligence. So there was a legitimate reason for that wall. This is how Dr. Martin Luther King, all of these wiretaps that the FBI undertook for Dr. Martin Luther King were undertaken in violation of all his rights as a citizen, because the FBI posited that he was working for a foreign power and was an enemy of the United States. And so they used intelligence resources to wiretap Dr. King in total contravention of his rights as a citizen. So that's the reason for this wall. It was a legitimate reason, but it had been carried to its extreme, because now intelligence and law enforcement, they were not talking to each other. We couldn't connect the dots, if you will. So in August of 2001, on the advice of Mike Chertoff and David Criss, I wrote a memo to the FBI. I couldn't write a memo to the CIA because that was not within my jurisdiction as a senior government official, but the FBI was. The FBI reported to the Deputy Attorney General. And I wrote a memo basically saying that intelligence agents, once they learned of something that was a potential violation of federal law, should immediately contact the law enforcement agents and lawyers in the criminal division of the Department of Justice. Sort of lowering the wall, if you will. I wrote that memo in August. And it was controversial at the time. I'd gotten approval from my boss, John Ashcroft, to write this. And then, of course, you write the memo in August, and then we were hit September 11. Over 3,000 American citizens perished. And I've talked about this only a few times since my book was completed. And every time I talk about it, it's cathartic, but yet very emotional for me. And I sense that the people who hear this talk, they've experienced, I'm surprised that many people have experienced the same thing that I did, but let me tell you what happened. After the attack, I really felt bad, and I mean bad. I felt guilty for not doing my job as a senior government official. When you think about what we at the Department of Justice are supposed to be doing, our essential function is to protect you guys, protect citizens, prevent harm to our citizens. And I felt like I let people down. I became ill. My internist recommended that I see a therapist. It was very difficult for me to do some of the things that I was supposed to be doing. I was able to power through it because I had a very good therapist. But it was something, as I said when I mentioned at the beginning I was going to talk about, it is something that is the most searing experience I've had in my career. And one of the reasons I left government, I'm going to talk about some of the other things that I did when I was in government, but one of the reasons I left government was because my therapist, in terms of helping me get through this period in my life, she prescribed medication for me. And at that time, we weren't very tolerant of people who were taking medication for depression. And if you were taking medication for depression, you had to notify people that controlled classified information, and you perhaps would have your classified clearance taken from you. We don't do that now, I don't think. But back then, you really had to do it. And as I was beginning to take medication to help me, I felt really concerned as to whether or not I was living up to all of my obligations for a classified clearance. So that, in addition to some other reasons, that was one of the reasons I decided to leave government. But, I talk about this in a sense that government officials have a lot on them. I have a great deal of respect for people who look after our safety and security day in and day out. And we need to do everything we can to support them. I was able to get through this with the help of a very good internist and an excellent therapist. And by the way, she is living, but has Alzheimer's now. But that's the beginning of my experience as the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And I want to just talk about another transition into another thing that I see, because one of the reasons, Mark, I think in terms of writing this book, I want to make certain that U.S. government officials have as much protection as we can give them as they do their jobs in trying to protect us. So I want to talk about what I call the ticking bomb scenario. And let me just give you a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical. I can't talk about anything that happened when I was Deputy Attorney General, but let's just posit this as a hypothetical. You get some information, you're a government official, and you get information that there are two individuals who know something about a drastic event that's going to occur on a Sunday afternoon. And that event is that a bomb is underneath FedEx Stadium someplace in Washington, D.C., and it's going to go off shortly after the game commences. Now, there are two men. One of them is in a CIA facility overseas, so you can interrogate him, obviously. But another person is in the United States, and he's in Alexandria. What do you do? What do you do about that guy? It's intelligence information, so it's not sufficient for probable cause for me to authorize an arrest warrant and get him arrested. Can't do that on intelligence information. And even if I did, you've got to read him his Miranda rights. He has a right to a public defender, and you have to interrogate this person. You have to interview this person before the game, and this information has come down to you at 11 o'clock in the morning. What do you do? What do you do? Think about it. And we today do not have any mechanism for handling that hypothetical I just gave you. And I think a lot of people have talked about what I'm going to recommend to you, and that is I think we desperately need a national security court. And we have something similar on the electronic surveillance side. That's the FISA court. And you can listen in to foreign persons with the probable, probable requisite and approved requisite. It goes to a series of judges, federal judges who sit on the FISA court. But we don't have anything when we really need to take someone off the street and interrogate them. I don't think this would ever, this national security court, I don't think it would ever meet much, but we may need to do it for things like interrogation or renditions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with that. But for some reason, we just can't get it done. The National Security Court, I posit, would be a little different than the FISA court, because you would have the judges, the prosecutors, you would have cleared defense lawyers for the individuals that you would come under the jurisdiction of the National Security Court, because it's really invasive kind of procedure to interrogate someone or to send someone out of the country. But I'm perplexed and dismayed that we haven't tried to do something to deal with this. And I can tell you, I don't think anyone in our national security apparatus would ever say that we are immune from foreign terrorists, dirty bombs. This is a threat that we all of us in this generation, we are all living under. I'm not suggesting that this apply to citizens, domestic terrorists. You just can't take someone's citizenship rights away. But I am suggesting that this would apply to potential foreign terrorists. And I do think it's a balance between civil liberties, which are very important, and protecting human beings. You know, the mission of the Department of Justice changed overnight after 9/11. It went from after-the-fact investigation and prosecution, but you had 19 men who were willing to give their lives for their evil cause. So you really can't deal with after-the-fact investigation and prosecution. It went from after-the-fact investigation and prosecution to prevention. Prevention bumps up against civil liberties. I think a national security court is a reasonable balance between civil liberties and safety, public safety and prevention, and I'd like to see us move on that, and I'm perplexed that we haven't. I mentioned rendition. John Ashcroft, my boss, was out of the country, and this is what I can talk to you about because there's a court case about this. A fellow was transiting from Europe who was a member of the Al-Qaeda, or who at least had gone to Al-Qaeda functions, and he was transiting through our country on his way to Montreal. I had to make a decision. He was a dual Canadian-Syrian citizen, and I had to make a decision right away. Do we send him to Canada, let him go to Canada? As you know how porous our borders are. I could send him to Syria. I did authorize the State Department and the rest of our government agencies to render this guy back to Syria because he was a citizen. He claims he was tortured in Syria. Eventually he was released and returned back to Canada. The Canadian government politically had changed. He was awarded millions of Canadian dollars for what had happened to him, and I was immediately sued in the United States and subject to congressional investigation as a potential violation of the anti-torture statute as the government official who authorized this, which is a criminal provision. It is a criminal provision. And some members of Congress were agitating to have a special counsel appointed to investigate me. The government agreed to represent me in court. But when agents from the Inspector General's office, agents from the FBI, agents from congressional investigative committees, when they wanted to talk to me, the government said, Mr. Thompson, we can't provide you legal representation for those meetings, for those events. Your job is to cooperate with everyone, and you cooperate with them. Well, my mother didn't raise a fool, and I am not meeting with an FBI agent as the subject of an investigation without my own lawyer. So what I had to do, I had moved on from government at this point, but what I had to do is I retained private counsel to represent me when I had these investigative meetings. And even with the friend and family rate from a very good law firm, I had to pay thousands of dollars as a private citizen for something that I had done in service to my country. Well, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals eventually ruled on this matter, and I was exonerated or ruled in my favor. I don't know if I was exonerated, but a lot of people still think I did something wrong. But government officials shouldn't have to pay money out of their own pocket to serve their country. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I did this. I undertook government service voluntarily, but I was 55 when President Bush asked me to become Deputy Attorney General. I was a senior partner in a major law firm, and I took a 90% pay cut to serve my country. And then, to rub salt into the wound, to have to pay thousands of dollars in legal fees really was not appropriate. So I hope we can do something about that. I hope we can have a national security court. And I hope we can use the power of the law that provides to help us protect innocent Americans and citizens from the evil of terror, which we still, ladies and gentlemen, I think are subject to in our country. And I'd like to just briefly mention another aspect of what I did as Deputy Attorney General. This is just, you get to be an old man and you tell stories, but this is an interesting story, but I think it points out some of the things that you did in government service, and that is President Bush, after the Enron collapse and a number of corporate scandals, WorldCom and Adelphia, a number of corporate scandals were ensuing. President Bush asked me to be the head of the corporate fraud task force. John Ashcroft, my boss, had been a United States Senator. He had received campaign contributions from all these companies, all these people who were under investigation, and so he couldn't do it. He had to recuse himself from many of these cases. So that's why I was asked to do this. And we were very aggressive with the corporate fraud task force. We were very aggressive in terms of dealing with individual executives who had committed fraud or who had done some things that certainly warranted investigation. But there were some people in President Bush's staff, some of the economists, thought we were being too aggressive and that we were unnecessarily demonizing business in the course of what we were doing. So one morning I get a call from Alberto Gonzales, who then was the White House counsel. He went on to become Attorney General of the United States. I get a call from Alberto Gonzales, and he said, tomorrow President Bush would like to meet with you. You're going to have some of the economic team, and you'll meet in the, I think, Roosevelt room. And so I called Bob Mueller, who also the president requested to meet. Bob was the director of the FBI, and said, what are we going to do? Do we want to talk about why we are using a task force approach to identifying these serious criminal investigations? Do we want to talk about why we are being aggressive in doing this? And we both decided, no, we don't want to get into that. Let's just talk to the president about the facts of some of the investigations that we had. The fact that some executives, financial officers had lied to their outside auditor. Some of the things that we were investigating, the lies and deception that some of these investigators were doing. And I remember vividly that as we were talking to President Bush, he was visibly moved by what we were saying to him. And at the end, he got up from the table and said, he called me LT. LT, I understand we can't let people get away from this. Bobby, LT, keep up the good work. And we left. President Bush obviously was dedicated to dealing in an appropriate and aggressive manner with law enforcement issues, whether they were violent crime, crime in the streets, as we say, or crime in the suites. I'll never forget that. And what is sad, and this is going to be I'm going to take a bipartisan swipe here at some of my successors in government. What is sad is since the Bush administration and during the course of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and even the Biden administration, white-collar enforcement has decreased. There are all kinds of reasons for that. Some may be good, some just may be unfortunate. I'm not going to get into the merits but the fact is white-collar criminal prosecutions of organizations, businesses, and individuals has dramatically decreased. And I think that creates a moral hazard when powerful, wealthy individuals and organizations can engage in criminal conduct and not be called to account for it in the criminal context. So I just want to talk about that as a moral hazard. And how much time do I have?
I think another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Something like that, 5 to
So
10
being an old man, can I tell a story here?
Sure.
So in your careers, we all have what if moments. What if something had happened? And so I have really an interesting what if moment, being sort of lower level, senior government official, that's not a contradiction in terms, but I got, because of 9/11 and because of the corporate fraud task force, I got to work very, very closely with President Bush. I admire him a great deal. I continue to serve on the board of his presidential center in Dallas. And when Justice Sandra Day O'Connor retired from the Supreme Court, President Bush moved to nominate his longtime friend and a very, very good lawyer, Harriet Miers, to be on the Supreme Court. And there was an outcry as to whether or not Harriet was appropriately conservative enough, or whether she had the right kind of experience to be on the Supreme Court. And she withdrew her name from consideration. And then I get a call from a senior official in the White House who had asked me whether I was interested in being on the Supreme Court. Well, you know, you really can't say you're not interested in becoming a Supreme Court justice. I was working at PepsiCo at the time. It would have been a big change in my income, but you can't say as a lawyer that you're not interested in. So immediately I talked to my wife, and I immediately called this gentleman back and said, you know, he was saying that I was going to get a call, and he wanted to make certain that I wouldn't turn down the president when the call came. So I said, of course I'm interested. Well, the call never came, obviously. You didn't introduce me as a former Supreme Court justice. The call never came, and I didn't know why the call didn't come until I read a book that Jan Crawford Greenberg did several years later about the Supreme Court. I forget the title of the book.
She's a CBS News commentator.
At the time,
Jan Crawford.
yeah,
Yep.
and I think the book was Jan Crawford Greenberg but I think now she goes by Jan Crawford. But she wrote in the book that some people had heard that President Bush was considering me, and a number of people from the Federalist Society. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Federalist Society, and I was a member of the Federalist Society, and they were considering me, and they went to dinner one night, and they talked about my possible nomination, and they said, "Oh, Larry's he's a good guy," and I had represented then Judge Clarence Thomas in his confirmation proceeding, along with some other people. They said, "He's a good guy, but we're worried he doesn't have any," I think Jan used the phrase, "any solid legal principles." I'd never spoken out on Second Amendment or abortion, and I'd been a practicing lawyer. You don't go around talking about those things when you're trying to get clients and make a living as a lawyer. But in any event, and they thought that I might, because I wasn't centered with sound principles, that I might become left-leaning like Justice Kennedy. So I never got the call. It took me several years to read that and find out why I didn't get the call. But life is funny, and that's a kind of a what-if moment. And the person that did get selected during that round was Justice Alito. So I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Would you like to sit next to me?
Yes.
And then I'm going to ask a couple of questions, sort of at the moderator's prerogative, and then open it up. I'm particularly eager to have the students who are here. And I'm told that there's an audience, a fairly large audience online. Are they able to ask questions, or no? They are not. Okay. Well, for those of you that are watching online, sorry. I'm going to veer off from what I plan to ask and ask you, if you had been nominated, would you have ended up like Anthony Kennedy?
I can't answer that.
Okay.
I would have heard the case, the facts, and the legal arguments, and made a decision.
Okay.
Do you want to tell the students why they may not know about Anthony Kennedy?
I think I'm probably not well qualified. Certainly, Justice Kennedy was nominated by President Reagan
Yes.
and emerged as the fulcrum of a Supreme Court whose vote on the court frequently, whether he voted with the conservative bloc or the more progressive bloc, often determined the outcome.
His position was more unpredictable than some of the other justices.
Yeah. And of course, that's less so with Justice Alito. Right. Let me just because it's Constitution Day and we're in a moment. As a former government official, I'd like you to comment, if you would, on the sort of specter of political violence that's now emerged. We've got two assassination attempts on former President Trump. There's a lot of bickering in Washington about who's responsible, about whether it's rhetoric in the broader world, whether the Secret Service, which I realize when you were Deputy Attorney General, was at the Treasury Department, not at the Department of Justice. It is now at the Homeland Security Department. But whether they've done a sufficient job, but as someone with insight into how the bureaucracy in Washington works, I wanted to sort of give you an opportunity to sort of address current
Yes,
events.
that's an interesting question, and I think we forget that this is not the first time we've had political violence in our country. And I'm looking at the young people. When I was looking like you guys, at your age, I went through an unbelievable period of political violence. President Kennedy was assassinated. His brother was assassinated. And Dr. King was assassinated. And I went through a time where we had to go through that. I think it really shaped my psyche for a number of years, probably shaped, what I wanted to do with my career. And so now we have the specter of something as horrible as what the country went through in the 60s. With respect to the first assassination attempt on former President Trump's life, I think that was very unfortunate and was not good work on the part of the Secret Service. And perhaps our response was not sufficient, because it's clear to me that, the Secret Service needs more resources. And we really need to move to make certain that it has adequate resources. I don't know enough, Mark, about the second case. You have to think of how was he able to get on the golf course? But at least he was identified and engaged by the Secret Service before anything horrible happened. But the political rhetoric in terms of violence has certainly increased recently, and I would say beginning with what happened in January 6th and going of 2020 and moving forward. And I think that's unfortunate that rhetoric has increased. And interestingly, if you read the polls, you read the polls and you have to determine whether they're accurate, there are a number of Americans who agree with violent conduct in the face of election disputes, and that's frightening. That's frightening.
Maybe then, it's something that you and I spoke about years ago, but I'm interested to hear your reaction now. And just particularly, I suspect that we've got some students who are thinking about careers in law. When you were a younger man, there was disagreement across the aisle, certainly between conservative and more liberal justices, judges, legal scholars. But there was a sense of comedy in the sense that you had some sense that folks from different camps were personally friendly.
Yes.
You've got these famous stories of Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg enjoying opera together and having a very close personal relationship, very close, certainly a friendly personal relationship. Has that changed in your experience over the course of your career? What does it mean, and what should a young person thinking about a career in the law, how should they approach that? Because there's certainly a lot of vitriol on campus these days, and you don't know how that's going to translate as people move on in their careers?
You know, there is more of the demonization of different points of view, demonization by one political party against the other and vice versa. And there's more of that. I have sort of a half serious and half humorous explanation for what's going on here. I know that, Director, that you served on the Hill, and it used to be that whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, when 5 o'clock came, you went to a bar together or you went to the office of another, and you know, famously Tip O'Neill and President Reagan would share a drink. And now people don't drink, period, and they certainly don't share drinks. So maybe that's caused all this. But you know, I don't know the reason for that, but there's more demonization going on, and you know, that's unfortunate. I think I don't see as much in the legal profession, but you're beginning to see conduct on the part of lawyers, especially during the last election, that I never thought I would see. Yeah, I've dealt with lawyers who play it loose sometimes, and obviously courts have sanctioned lawyers who have given, you know, bad information to the courts or have not abided by the code of ethics of lawyers, code of professional responsibility that we lawyers are supposed to abide by. But I have not seen the outright, just flat out lies made to legislative tribunals or to the courts as I saw during the 2020 election. And I was very disappointed in my profession and those lawyers who engaged in that. And I'm hopefully that kind of thing is going to be policed a little bit more and will not happen in the aftermath of the 2024 election, but we'll see.
Wanted to come back for a brief moment to your comment about being called into the White House to talk with President Bush about the corporate fraud task force. Because I think the subtext of that story, which you perhaps purposefully don't mention when you tell the story, is that you were being summoned by others who had hoped that you would take a different approach. The students in the room and those watching online are likely to find themselves, if they go into government service, in situations where there are cross currents within the bureaucracy.
Oh, yes.
And you were put in a position where there were people in that room who probably hoped you had taken a different approach, and you had called Director Mueller and discussed how you would approach it. What I think it sounds like by talking about the illustrating the depth of the deception, you headed off what could have been a meeting with a different outcome. How did you think about that, and how would you advise a young person thinking about going into government about how to suss out what may be happening and prepare for it ahead of time?
Yes. Well, I think all of you, especially the students, you have your what I would call true north. And I've been fortunate in terms of the way I was raised and the mentors I've had and the legal training that I've had, where I tried to make decisions, and Bob and I tried to make our decisions professionally. We were, at that time, experienced prosecutors. Even though he was the head of the FBI, he'd been the U.S. attorney in charge of in Boston, and he'd been the head of the criminal division of the Department of Justice. And we were making decisions, good faith decisions, based upon what we knew in terms of how to handle criminal problems. We weren't trying to make a political decision. I don't think that the people who opposed what we were doing opposed it for political reasons. They opposed it from economic reasons, and that's the difference between law and economics. Law is more of a normative field, where economics is more quantitative, black and white. And they thought that we were demonizing unnecessarily business, and that would have an economic effect on the economy. I didn't detect in that exchange, if you will, anything that we were, any attempt to do something politically. But President Bush respected us. He obviously trusted us. And when we presented him with some of the things that we were working on, he was very moved, as I said. And he said, we cannot let people get away with this. And so I think as a young lawyer, you have to stay to your true north. One of the really great things about the law is that when one of you students get out of law school, you're going to be you're held to the same professional obligation as I am. And by the time you get out of law school, I will have practiced 55 years maybe, but you have the same professional obligation. And I remember there was a major antitrust case several years ago, many years ago actually, and one of the partners in a major law firm was destroying documents that should have been produced to the government. And he had a young, I don't know if she was I know it was a she, had a young first year or second year lawyer who was helping him and who knew what was going on. And the New York bar came down not only on him, but on her, because she did not blow the whistle on what was going on. She did not refuse to do what he was doing. And at a minimum, she should have just ran out of the room and said, I don't want any part of this. I'm leaving this firm. But she got sanctioned too. And so the law applies to someone who's senior like myself or to someone who's going to just be graduating from law school. And I think we need to apply those ethical norms. Now can I say something about norms?
Yeah.
This is, nobody asked me what keeps you up at night. And one of the things that I've seen happen, especially in the context of the Department of Justice, and it's happened just in the past few years, is that there are a lot of norms in which we've operated on in our country for years, especially since Watergate, where the Department of Justice makes decisions on who to prosecute based upon facts, treating like cases the same way, like cases in a like manner, independent of political influence. This has gone on under Republican administrations, under Democrat administrations, certainly my entire professional life. If you turn the page back, there have been incursions into this, but not serious ones. I know that Franklin Roosevelt tried to get involved in some criminal prosecutions, and you all may recall Justice Robert Jackson. He gave him a stiff arm and wouldn't go along with it. Some people wanted George Washington to sort of rein in Edmund Randolph, who was the first Attorney General, and George Washington wouldn't go along with it. These are norms. These are not written in the Constitution. They're not anywhere except this is the way we've governed ourselves. These are what I call rule of law norms. And you can't just put everything in a book. And we need norms in terms of how we run our society. And now these norms are eroding. And in fact, some people don't agree with these norms. Some people want the FBI to be politically accountable to the President of the United States. Some people want more political people in the various U.S. attorney offices around our country. We have 94 different U.S. attorneys' offices in our country. And in each office, there's only one political appointee. Only one. That's the U.S. attorney herself. Everybody else is there because of their merits. And I worry about the erosion of our norms and what kind of norms are going to replace them. Are we now going to be a country of just, political influence in terms of our justice system? I don't know. But this is what keeps me up at night.
Let me ask one more question, then I'm going to ask the students to take over. You just told us what keeps you up at night now. I'd like you to imagine yourself in college. I'd like to know what kept you up then that you should not have worried about.
Oh, I don't want you to know what I was.
And then secondly, what were you not aware of that you should have been worried about back then?
I was a child of the '60s, and I wanted to help people. And I wanted to be a social worker. Are there any social workers here in this? And so I had a professor who said, there's nothing wrong with being a social worker. He called me up, he was a history professor, he called me up to the podium after class. He said, but have you considered law? My mother was a cook, my dad worked on the railroad, and I'd never had any interaction and I was a junior. In college, I'd never had any interaction with a lawyer. I said no, and I took a few what we call pre-law courses. But I'm saying all that because I think in an interesting way, I feel the same satisfaction about my career now, 50 years later, having been a lawyer, as I think I would have as a social worker. I've helped people. I've helped institutions, I've helped organizations. I think I've helped my society become better. And, as I say in the book, I think I've tried to do my best and I've done my part. And I think we all should try to do our part to help our societies become better. So in a strange sort of way, 50 years after deciding to become a lawyer as opposed to a social worker, I still have satisfaction in knowing that I've helped people. I've made people's lives better, and I'm pleased with that.
I'd like now to open it up to students, and I see a hand, so wait for the microphone to come by so that the people online can hear you. And kudos to you for being the first student asking a question. That's hard.
Hello, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We've seen in the past couple months the DOJ doing federal indictments and prosecutions of former President Trump, and in 2016 we saw a similar kind of whistleblowing against Secretary Clinton. What do you think the obligation is for the DOJ to consider political consequences when fulfilling their role of kind of bringing up misdeeds or perceived misdeeds?
I would like to think that DOJ should not consider the political consequences. And the question is, did the person, notwithstanding the fact that they are a high government official, violate the law? That's what you should be looking at, and not whether or not they're a former senator. I know when I was in the Department of Justice, when I had to make decisions of a real political nature, in the sense that I had to make a decision about a United States senator or a congressman, and we had to do that. What we did, and it's not being done now, but we had a very senior civil servant in the department by the name of David Margolis, and David passed. But I would, and John Ashcroft, by the way, we would defer a great deal of what to do on that matter to David, because we didn't want the appearance that we were making sort of a political decision on those individuals. That may be too cautious, too conservative, but I know that was my practice. But now, having said what I said, when you're dealing with obviously someone who's a former senator, former Secretary of State, former president, you can't be blind to the reality that this is a different kind of prosecution than, say, an executive or a drug dealer. But you really shouldn't. You really shouldn't worry about the political consequences. You really shouldn't. You have to have some common sense on how you shape the case and prosecutorial discretion. But I'd like to think we're not worried about that. I may be naive, I don't know, but that's what I'd like to think.
Terrific.
Hello, it's my honor being here, and thank you for your lecture. So John Marshall, before he passed away in 1835, he wrote to his best friend Joseph Story, quote, "The Union has been preserved thus far by miracle, and it does not continue." So looking back to what Marshall said before he passed away and thinking about the rule of law right now in the United States, do you think the country has been preserved and flourished through hundreds of years through the idea of rule of law? And in that way, was our Chief Justice Marshall wrong? Or like in what way does the idea of rule of law changed from his time
Yeah.
to now?
That's a very good quote. I'd forgotten about that quote. Thank you for bringing it to my attention again. Yes, I may have been living in a dream world for the first 46 years of my law practice, because I thought we were pretty strong. I thought we were united on some of these core principles. No political interference in Department of Justice decisions. President Bush didn't entertain any kind of briefings on criminal cases. We kept the White House informed through the Deputy Attorney General and somebody I might delegate who would talk to the White House counsel, because obviously a major criminal investigation, the White House can't be caught flat-footed, but we never talked to the president about some of these things. He didn't want that kind of information. But young man, I don't want to give you a pessimistic answer, but I actually think when I read about some of the things, and I'm going to just call it out, some of the things in I think it's called the 2025 Project 2025, and I read some of the essays by some other intellectuals and lawyers. I may have been too naive, and I do think the rule of law, certainly as it relates to the workings of the Federal Department of Justice, I think the rule of law is tenuous. And when you look at what was discussed in the recent immunity case by the Supreme Court, when the president cajoled the acting Attorney General of the United States who has a responsibility, by the way, he'd taken an oath to support the Constitution, and tried to cajole him to do something where the acting Attorney General said there are no facts to support that. We've looked at it, and we can't say something that's not true. And now the president has immunity over that conduct. That worries me. That worries me.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm curious about, Bush has notably been very silent since his presidency on how he feels about the current standing of the Republican Party, et cetera. And as you are, writing a book, pontificating on your ideas, I'm curious about, firstly, what you think is the responsibility of a former government official or a former president to speak on, you talk about norms, to speak on slipping of norms or eroding of norms. And secondly, if you feel the silence of Bush as kind of a unofficial gag order as you're talking about your ideas as a former Bush official, how you sort of contend with the yoke of that silence.
I can't speak for the president, obviously, but I know that he has made some statements along with other former presidents, as, certainly along with Clinton, in terms of some of the conduct of some of the elections. I can't remember exactly what those statements were, but there were, with other former presidents. And I know he is a strong supporter of democracy. I know he's a very strong supporter of the rule of law, and exactly how he chooses to be, to get involved in this, I really, it's up to him. There are lots of, terrific projects going on at the Bush Center in terms of helping wounded veterans and trying to preserve democracy across the world. And, you know, you have to weigh the work that you're doing in the context of necessarily speaking out or something like that. I'm free to speak out because I'm not you know, if I was still at PepsiCo and you had invited me here, Wendy, I would be giving you a completely different talk than the one I just gave. So I'm a lot freer, I think, to make my comments than some other people are. I hope you understand. Mhm.
Okay, thanks. It's on? Yeah. So I'd like to push you a little bit about what the Bush administration did after 9/11, in particular the Justice Department. And you talked about some of the cases and sort of the security concerns. So, you know, the Department of Homeland Security is created by Congress in 2003. But before that, certainly in the immediate aftermath, there were people who were detained. And the estimates can range from 800 to 1,400 people. Some U.S. citizens, some not U.S. citizens, some foreign nationals in the United States at the time. So, and they were detained for varying lengths of time, and then eventually they were released. And then we had two cases, Boumediene and Hamdi, about sort of actions taken by the Bush administration. So, can you sort of talk about what the Justice Department, how that sort of came about, your thinking in the Justice Department about reacting to what was an unprecedented attack on U.S. soil since World War II, since Pearl Harbor? It was the largest, most serious attack with the biggest loss of life. So obviously, and you don't have a Homeland Security and you don't have an apparatus. So could you tell us a little bit about how how those decisions are made, or how you thought about
Sure.
security?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And it's in a way worse than Pearl Harbor because citizens, innocent citizens who were going to work that day were massacred. Whereas at Pearl Harbor, at least you had soldiers who were attacked. Not justifiably, but it was So, Wendy, I think, I'll just speak for myself. I made mistakes because there was no playbook as to what you should do when 3,000 of your citizens were murdered by foreign terrorists. There was no, I do know one thing, and I'm not ashamed to say this. I made a vow to myself that something like that was not going to happen again on my watch. Did I do everything correct? No. I had a friend who came up to me and talked me out of one of the things we had done in the Bureau of Prisons, because there was evidence that some of the people who came into the Bureau of Prisons as religious officials were actually radicalizing some of the prisoners and masquerading as lawyers, or some of the lawyers who were coming in to represent these people were really radicalizing the prisoners. And I authorized a process by which we would listen in on conversations between prisoners and lawyers. And that was wrong. That was not something I should have done. But we did it because we didn't know what to do. My own personal North Star was I didn't want it to happen again. We made some mistakes. I think some of the intelligence sharing apparatus that a lot of people were afraid of at the very beginning, and it was codified in the Patriot Act, a lot of those provisions have continued to stay in place and have been re-upped. And I think it's proper to re-examine them every so often and sunset them if they're not re-upped. But the enhanced interrogation versus interrogation the normal way, I think the studies that I've read indicate that the traditional method of interrogating people that was primarily utilized by the FBI was far superior than the enhanced interrogation techniques that were used by the intelligence agencies. So perhaps we shouldn't have gone the other way. But they're just, we didn't know what we didn't know. And if you look back and do you say, did we do everything right? No, we didn't. But we did the best we could, and we did everything in good faith. And one of the things I'm really proud of, and this was led by President Bush, is that we didn't try to demonize people who were Muslims. And I'm really proud of that. That could have gone a different way and an ugly way after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, for students, just to know that President George W. Bush gave a talk on Thursday night. The attacks happened on a Tuesday morning. Thursday night, he gave a presidential address, and in it, he made sure to say, we are not an enemy of Islam. We are, people who are of the Islamic faith or Muslim are not our enemy. He went out of his way to sort of diffuse that kind of situation. And so that's, if you haven't lived through that kind of rhetoric in the last couple of years, it's really important that there have been presidents who do that. Now, they also, waged two military actions, really, Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. So there's lots of ways in which we want to learn from history, but we don't always. So the other is a personal one. Maybe we'll end on this one if there's no other talks. I don't know if Michael wants. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, but I want to.
No. I have an ending question. So
Oh,
give it to
okay.
Professor Warrenberg.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I old enough to have lived through the early 2000s too. I'm curious about your proposal for a national security court. I want to make sure I have this right. It sounds intriguing to me, but am I right that as you posed it, this would be a court which would be for non-U.S. citizens
Yes.
to appear in? U.S. citizens would not be subject
No.
to this court, right?
Yes, sir.
So, and I think, if nothing else, for a practical sense, that makes a lot of sense. So it'd be tough to put U.S. citizens in this. But again, the purpose of this is for national security and to protect individuals, which, as you say, has been the crucial thing. Most of the domestic terrorism in this country has been committed by U.S. citizens.
Yes.
Oklahoma City, and then I'm a history professor, so when I talk about terrorism, I go far back. The bombing on Wall Street earlier in the 20th century.
East St. Louis, Tulsa.
East St. Louis, Tulsa. The Ku Klux Klan in the South,
Yes.
which was called a terror organization. Right? These are all U.S. citizens involved in the violence. So when we have if we imagine an institution that's framed to say national security is a problem by definition, just if we just look at that institution, I know you know better, but it would be received as an institution that frames it in a very common way as primarily something that foreigners
Yes.
do, right? Wouldn't that be a problem potentially? And this continues to be a problem. And I haven't even brought up the issue of gun violence. 1,100 people dead
Yes.
by U.S. citizens in mass shootings since
Yes.
1982, when it started to measure. So, if that's included in that could be included as danger to
Yes.
normal people. So, if we then say, well, the real national security threat is this thing, and we're targeting, or the danger is foreign citizens, are we not then contributing to a certain rhetoric?
I understand your question, and it's a good one. I just, from the standpoint of our vulnerability, let me just first deal with the potential foreign terrorists. That still remains an area of vulnerability, I think, and one that could be serious when you have these rogue state actors and who can do some really damaging things now I'm not going to even suggest what they can do. And I don't want to give, especially in light of the events of recent years, I do not want to give the government a blank check to deal with these individuals. You don't want that to happen, even for a foreign person. But I don't want government officials to become so paralyzed that they decide, I'm not going to ruin my career, I'm not going to get involved and do nothing. So that's my thinking on the national security. On the domestic security, I didn't get into it in my talk, but there's some things that we can do. And that is in terms of law enforcement techniques. We still have limited the FBI's ability to do things in the internet that you and I can do, which makes no sense to me. If I can go into a computer and look at and search things on the internet, why can't the FBI do that? And you're right, domestic terrorism is a real issue. I think we do have some very good techniques in play in terms of human intelligence. The FBI is very good at that. You remember what happened in Michigan? So I'm not suggesting at all we turn a blind eye toward domestic terrorism. It's a very, very serious problem. But I cannot bring myself to say that we have to have a court that will take away my constitutional rights, no matter how bad it might appear. John Ashcroft, after 9/11, we were really trying to search for answers and what could we have done differently? What do we need to do? And John called all the senior officials in the Department of Justice together and said, I want you to think about things that think outside the box as to things that we can do that this won't happen again. And so one of my colleagues brought up something that was really awful. And John looked at him and said, I said think outside the box, but not outside the Constitution.
So I'm going to ask the last question, is especially for our younger audience members, is you talked about the sort of the disappointment of being told you might become asked to be nominated for a Supreme Court seat, and then the call never came, or that you had gone through this incredibly personally traumatic but nationally traumatic incident and had to work through it. So could you tell us, I mean, you said you got some counseling and that really helped. What lessons can you impart to sort of 19, 20, 21-year-olds about forging through disappointment, or, you know, kind of like the world changed in a moment, and how do you sort of adjust to that? Because it's hard to do when you're younger and you haven't lived through them to know that things could be okay again.
Well, you know, it's an individual reaction, but I can just tell you who has been helpful to me as I've had to deal with disappointments and in my personal life and in my career, and that is I've had friends and mentors, and you're at one of the top universities in the world, not just in the United States, and you know, stay close to your colleagues, stay close to your professors, and reach out and absorb what they can, you know, their life experiences and their wisdom. And you can't do it alone. To your point, you can't do it alone. You have to rely on friends. You have to rely on your professors, and just try to be a sponge and absorb everything that you can. You've been presented with this great opportunity at one of the top universities in the world, and just soak it all up. And it will, when you soak up enough, at some point you can use that when you have difficult times in your life or your career.
Larry Thompson, thank you for being here at Brown.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Take care.
Yeah.
And the book, let's remind everybody, the book is called Quiet Counsel.
Quiet Counsel. I stole the title from my former boss, Indra Nui, who is and we didn't get a chance to go into the PepsiCo experience, but she's a visionary leader at PepsiCo, and she wrote a book that made the New York Times bestseller list, and she thanked me for my quiet counsel to her over the years.